play two roles here in this panel. I'm going to moderate the discussion and also will give a substantive presentation. Before I introduce the other panelists, let me say a few words of background. First, we're going to be looking here not just at commerce involving certain countries, but specifically about commerce among these countries: North Korea, Iran, Syria, Myanmar, and to some degree Pakistan, although I think the Pakistani role may be a bit more historical than current. This topic of what is the next challenge we face with North Korea really goes very well with what happened at the last panel, where in effect I think we heard that the issue of North Korea possessing nuclear weapons remains a deep concern, but in a certain sense it has an aspect of being a fait accompli. We are also, however, concerned about what may happen next, namely that this kind of technology will be shared with others. And I believe we already have evidence that North Korea is, in fact, or has attempted to share certainly the ability to manufacture nuclear weapons with one other country, namely Syria. So what we'll do in this panel is take a look across the board at the way a lot of these countries that are outside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, such as Pakistan and North Korea, or who are in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or who are seeking to act in ways that are inconsistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, such as Myanmar, possibly, how we try to deal with this new problem. I should add that this issue is as fresh as this morning's headlines. Many of you have seen the article by David Sanger indicating that only 2 weeks ago the United States was able to stop a vessel, not board it, but sort of challenge a North Korean vessel going to Myanmar with a load of what was believed to be missile-related technology and equipment. So this is was coming from North Korea, and it's a challenge that is ongoing in terms of how we try to manage the flow of technology away from countries to additional countries, and try to hold the line on this very difficult area. The CIA's disclosure that between 2001 and 2007, North Korea had secretly supplied Syria with a plutonium production reactor underscored the growing importance of collaboration among what I'll call the Non-Proliferation Treaty outlier states. And as I said, some of the countries of concern are not in the treaty, and others are in the treaty but not adhering to its requirements. So this panel will explore recent and current WMD relevant trade among North Korea, Pakistan, Iran, and Syria, and Myanmar, and we'll try to understand how these interactions are working. The panel will review the specifics of WMD relevant trade among the states, with a particular focus on nuclear and missile, but we'll also look, at least in my comments, in one or two spots, it's the possibility of chemical weapon collaboration. And we will try to see the steps that are being taken to deal with this very difficult international challenge. The challenge is made all the more difficult because we are already imposing sanctions against some of the players because of their own indigenous nuclear activities. And so we don't have necessarily a fresh set of tools or new pressure points that we can take advantage of as we deal with this new segment of the problem, that is to say the exports and commerce. I'm going to offer a condensed review of the history of weapon of mass destruction relevant cooperation among the 5 outlier states, and then we'll have the other panelists talk in greater depth about different portions of this. Jeffrey Lewis will, let me start first with Joshua Pollack. Joshua is going to give an in-depth look at North Korean assistance to Iran and Syria's missile programs, and also the possible reciprocal assistance that Tehran may be providing to Pyongyang as Iran's own missile program advances. I think at this stage of the game, the Iranians have access to solid rocket fuel technology, which probably is more advanced than North Korea's. Um, he will also explore mechanisms for curtailing this dangerous trade. Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, to my far left, will then examine the North Korean nuclear assistance to what some specialists now believe is a nascent clandestine nuclear program in Myanmar, and he'll examine how that assistance, again, might be constrained. We were hoping to have a spokesman here from the U.S. Treasury Department because Treasury is now playing a very significant role in applying sanctions to some of these entities and individuals that are involved in this clandestine trade. But it turns out the U.S. Treasury Department was here at the very high level in Seoul last week for official discussions, and we just couldn't get a second Treasury official of rank to join us today. But it's an issue that is being addressed actively, and including the participation of South Korea in some of the application of these sanctions. Let me just note that Joshua Pollack is a senior policy analyst specializing in arms control and deterrence and non-proliferation at the Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC. And he's contributed frequently to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and Arms Control Wonk. And Dr. Jeffrey Lewis is Arms Control Wonk, as many of you know. He is the responsible for that blog and directs the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. He's the former director of nuclear strategy and non-proliferation at the New America Foundation, and previously was a research scholar at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. So let me sort of begin with some of the comments that I was going to make regarding the kinds of activities that have been going on among these various states. One question arises, of course, as to why I picked these five: Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Myanmar. And I think the reason is that all of these, in one way or another, are operating outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They all seem to have an interest in nuclear weapons and missiles, and we'll be hearing about Myanmar's in particular later on. And they all seem to rely on outside assistance to advance their own programs, and therefore, maybe looking to each other to fill in certain gaps. And there has been a history of mutual assistance among them. So these are the five that seem to be of greatest interest at the moment. I think as we look at the patterns that have occurred over the last several years, maybe the past decade, there are really 4 or 5, 6 different ways in which these countries seem to assist each other. In some cases, country A manufactures an item and transfers it to country B. So this might be the example of the P1 or P2 centrifuges that were manufactured in Pakistan, and then A.Q. Khan forwarded them to Iran as part of his interactions with them. And I think, by the way, in the case of Pakistan, there is this other uncertainty as to whether we consider this officially sanctioned trade or the work of a rogue participant. But nonetheless, it was technology developed in and for Pakistan that then found its way to Iran, and specifically certain items. Secondly, there have been just transfers of technology to a second country, which then does the manufacturing. And I think these are cases where you see this frequently in the missile area, where technology for production of Scud missiles or production of the Nodong is transferred. So it is not merely the physical missile that may be transferred from one state to another, but also the ability to manufacture them, which is that much more serious. There seem to be cases in which country A procures an item illegally and illicitly and then transfers it to country B. And we saw some of this with some of the North Korean networks that were based in Europe acquiring items that would then be going to Syria to support the Al-Khaybar reactor. A fourth pattern is that, and we've seen this, we believe, is that country A may manufacture and test items with country B. And I think the classic case here is that during the moratorium on long-range missile tests in North Korea, which occurred at the end of the Clinton administration, during this period there were multiple tests in Iran of the same missile, the Shahab-3 or the Nodong. And I think this was an episode in which you had sort of a proxy, the two countries collaborating, supposedly individuals from North Korea, scientists in Iran to observe the tests and so forth. And there is the possibility that there was a reciprocation of this kind of work when there were nuclear tests in North Korea. There may have been Iranian scientists present there, and I'd say I have a question mark next to that on my notes. We're not certain that that occurred, but it has been speculated. And sometimes there are services that country A might provide for country B. I don't have a good example of this having occurred already, but in the future you could imagine perhaps that North Korea might undertake the conversion of uranium for another country like Pakistan or possibly Iran. So I think we have 4 or 5 different ways that countries can collaborate with each other, and we have examples of most of them already, and we can imagine some possible ones for the future. Let me just review a couple of the kinds of activities that have occurred. Most of this will be familiar to you, but I think it's worth just going down the list. Coming out of North Korea, exports from North Korea include exports to Iran of missiles, Scuds and the Nodongs, possibly the Musaden, which was a Soviet-designed missile originally. In the missile area, we've seen possibly uranium going to Iran, or maybe it will go to Iran out of North Korea, conceivably a warhead design, possibly nuclear test data. Certainly the North Koreans know more about plutonium production at this point than the Iranians do, because the North Koreans have done it, and the Iranians, we think, are aspiring to it with the production reactor at Iraq. So these are, in some cases, in the missile cases, acts that have already occurred, and I'd say on the nuclear side, acts we might anticipate for the future. North Korea's exports to Syria included Scuds and the Scud manufacturing technology, and then in the nuclear side, there was the reactor, the Al-Khabar reactor, possibly a fuel fabrication plant, possibly reprocessing technology, and conceivably a weapon design, from what we might know. North Korea to Pakistan was the Nodong missile, which became the Gowri, and possibly there's been some nuclear warhead design sharing back and forth. And in Myanmar, North Korea is accused, as we'll hear, of exporting either missiles or missile technology, principally, I believe, Scuds, and then also perhaps uranium mining and maybe enrichment technology as well, which Jeffrey Lewis will speak about in greater detail. The technology out of Pakistan, I want to reiterate, there's uncertainty whether this was purely AQCON operating alone or whether elements of the government supported it. So I want to be sure that we're not making direct accusations about national activity, but there's just some question mark. And also, I think the trend is not current. I think most of the episodes are in the past, and that recently we've seen this taper off. We've seen Pakistan adopt some fairly strict export controls. So we may be seeing a shift. But historically, of course, there was uranium enrichment technology that was sent to North Korea, possibly the weapons design, conceivably a warhead design, maybe later on nuclear test data. I'm just speculating about the latter, but I think the centrifuge technology is well understood. That was part of the AQCON operation. To Iran, I don't know that I have good examples, but it wouldn't be beyond question that certain things Pakistan has today are desired by Iran, and I guess I focus on cruise missile technology. I have no indication that this has been shared, but if you were to speculate as to what to watch for, what would we be concerned about, it might be this new area where Pakistan has got some very important cruise missile capabilities, and where the Iranians, I think, are a whole notch below that. So far, nothing that I've seen that connects Pakistan to Syria or to Myanmar. There are just a couple of more points here on the who's doing what. What has Syria done? Well, so far I'm not sure that there have been exports from Syria, but one could, again, speculate as to what might be of interest if these countries are collaborating. And Syria is known to have one of the most advanced chemical weapon capabilities in the world, and I'm not quite sure how it stacks up against North Korea's. So it might be that there is some interest in trading information, sharing agent production capabilities. The There might be munitions manufacture, which we're seeing in Syria. That is potentially something that North Korea would benefit from, production facilities and so forth. So I think that's an area of a question mark, and maybe also Syria to Iran. There's also been collaboration, I'm sure, between Syria and Iran on missile transfers to Hezbollah, which is a sort of different variant. Finally, I don't think we've seen Myanmar sending anything out, but my understanding is that they have some uranium mining capacity, and it's possible that we might see that become of interest to Iran, which supposedly is hurting in terms of its access to natural uranium. Let's spend a couple of minutes on constraining weapon of mass destruction-related trade. And I'd say there are maybe 6 or 7 different strategies that are out there being utilized, I'd say with mixed results, but perhaps with some success, as I'll come to in a moment. First, I think there is the attempt to deter these exports by means of UN sanctions and parallel unilateral sanctions by the United States and/or I know South Korea, the EU, and some others have been pretty active here. There is the effort to dissuade or there can be the effort to dissuade this behavior by having a patron of the country that we're worried about lean on that country. So this is the discussion, in effect, we had about China leaning on North Korea and trying to discourage it from building up its own nuclear capability and from conducting nuclear tests, but also, one would hope, China trying to persuade North Korea not to engage in some of these illicit exports. If David Sanger's article is any example, however, to the extent China may be doing this, it's not necessarily been a successful strategy. There are efforts at interdiction, denial of port and airspace access. That we know about through the Proliferation Security Initiative. It is also embedded in some of the UN sanctions against Iran and North Korea. There has been the effort to interrupt some of these transactions by denial of access to Western banking systems. Again, mixed success, but this is a new dimension of the effort that I think was initiated during the Bush administration and now has been adopted and reinforced by the Obama administration. There also seems to be something sort of short of military action, but heading in that direction, which is the effort to interfere with some of these countries' nuclear programs, and this kind of direct action through sabotage or targeted assassinations, things of this kind, that we've seen in Iran in order to slow the Iranian program, might also play a role in efforts to deter or interrupt or interdict some of the exports if that were to come about. I think some countries are potentially susceptible to this kind of approach. Others, I think, are just insulated. I think North Korea, it's very difficult to imagine a country which is so unwired as North Korea, being susceptible to a computer worm attack and so forth. But in the case of Iran and some of the others, perhaps that might be part of the strategy. There's also the option of military action, very unappealing, especially vis-a-vis North Korea. And then there's the use of red lines, which is sort of the declarations that we don't want to see this behavior. Those do not seem to be working, at least in some respects, with regard to North Korea. Throughout all of this, obviously, intelligence is very crucial because you can't know what you're trying to stop unless you see this. Now, there has been some success. We have seen the blocking of certain imports to Iran, such as uranium, maraging steel, carbon fiber, and vacuum pumps. And to the extent that Iran is seeking to acquire these via North Korea, they seem to be having some trouble. So in that respect, some of the efforts to curtail imports may be working. We have ended, it seems, the North Korea nuclear exports to Syria. That's as a result of the Israeli attack. We are certainly complicating Iranian and North Korean shipping and financing by virtue of the UN resolutions, the no bunkering rules, the boarding agreements, and so forth through the Proliferation Security Initiative. We've seen increased international attention to export controls in many countries, which are also helping to suppress this. In China, Dubai, Singapore, Malaysia, other cases. There has been the use of designations of individuals to supplement prosecutions and try to persuade individuals and entities not to engage in this trade. And there have been, some past accomplishments that are paying dividends, such as the disruption of the AQ-Khan network and the halting of the Syrian reactor project. Nonetheless, all of these programs are continuing to grow domestically. In Iran, the uranium program is growing, the enrichment program. In North Korea, the programs are growing. Pakistan, the programs are growing. And so we have a sense, I think, that it's been very hard to keep pace with the tools trying to stop this expansion don't seem to be keeping pace with the capabilities of the countries that are the targets. Finally, let me just think about some next steps. I think we're going to see further constraints on shipping, perhaps expanding inspection authority into territorial seas, which does not quite exist now under some of the UN resolutions. There might be new obligations on registry states. In the North Korea sanctions case, a registry state is, if a ship is if boarding is being sought or interdiction is being sought, the registration state has the obligation to escort the vessel into port so that an inspection can take place. If it is unwilling to allow the actual inspection on the high seas, but we don't have similar requirements in the Iranian case, so one could see the extension going over into that area. And I think we're seeing slowly improving implementation of the sanctions resolutions and also UN Resolution 1540. So, we may be seeing this kind of curtailment of the activities by virtue of other states tightening up their own controls. In the United States, there is consideration of some very heavy-hitting sanctions on Iran, including prohibitions on the purchase of crude oil and trying to get that universalized. And that may be helpful in terms of discouraging them from any exports and also imports among these outlier states. And conceivably, we may see some more direct action in the Iranian case that may have a role to play here. So with that background, and I'm sorry to just have sort of rushed through it, let us turn to some of the other speakers and have some additional detail on some of these cases. Let's see, Joshua, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Asan Institute and also the James Martin Center for making it possible for me to be here and share this with you today. The presentation that I'm about to give you now is largely based on research that I've done over the past year or so, which will be presented in the Non-Proliferation Review next month. So please look for a fuller account there if the subject interests you. Specifically, the subject is North Korea's missile supply relationships with Iran and Syria. I'm not going to address Burma or Myanmar too much. We'll leave that for Jeffrey. But I think this can be summed up in a few simple lines and then unpacked in a little more detail, and we'll try to get through it in 15 minutes. To put it very simply, today, North Korea is the single most important supplier of ballistic missile technology to Iran and Syria. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, North Korea was a supplier of missile technology to at least 7 states, including Iran and Syria. So Iran, Syria, and at least 5 others. Now, North Korea's relationships with other states in the field have shrunk down to the hardcore of these 2 other states, but these ties have also changed. They've become more collaborative. Instead of shipping complete ballistic missiles, the North Koreans are now engaged in a much more collaborative undertaking with countries that could still reasonably be called their customers, but it is not simply a question of cash for missiles. So how do we know that? Why did that happen? I think there is data available on this that is hidden in plain sight, and I'll walk you through that in a moment. But the question of why is a little more elusive. I think in part these changes came in response to some of the efforts of the international community, which Sandy Spector just touched on, to curtail the global missile trade. So in part this reflects an adaptation to otherwise successful policies to restrain the missile trade. So we can look at these policies and try to establish how they brought about this change, to what extent they've been successful, and where they haven't been quite so successful. So now to give it to you in a little more detail. I think that we could envision North Korea's missile trade, metaphorically speaking, as a funnel. A funnel has two meanings. The first meaning is that they acquire technology from multiple sources, package it together, and then funnel it to their customers. That's, I think, the most obvious meaning. But the second meaning is a funnel narrows. And as I just mentioned, there has been this narrowing effect where their customer base has diminished considerably in recent years. So with that in mind, there's been a progression first from the acquisition of technology, which originally served North Korea's own needs, then to exports of complete missiles, then to exports of the production technology itself, meaning the machine tools and the processes to actually build missiles. And following the export of the production technology, there was the export of parts and components to feed these new production lines that had been set up in countries like Iran, Syria, Libya. Following these types of technology transfers, we've now seen joint development, which is a relatively new development. Since we have limited time, we'll not dwell on acquisition, except to say that we don't know the full story of where North Korea's missile technology comes from. Clearly, the missiles have a Soviet design heritage. There may also be a Chinese connection, somewhat lost in the midst of time. There are a few bits of evidence attesting to this. But the North Koreans also have regularly acquired advanced electronics and other parts and components from Japan, among other places, from China, from other countries as well. When it comes to ballistic missile exports, there is a perception that North Korea frequently ships missiles all around the world. And I have reason to believe that this is an outdated perception. The Congressional Research Service in the United States releases a report annually on arms transfers to developing nations. And while the data are approximate and are obscured in certain senses, comparing the versions from year to year makes it possible to reconstruct missile deliveries from year to year. So I've done this reconstruction. The numbers are rounded off. There are some inconsistencies, but a sharp pattern nevertheless emerges, which is to say, since 1987, when North Korea began exporting ballistic missiles, starting with Iran as its first customer, North Korea has been the world's most active shipper of missiles, beating out the Russians and the Chinese by a bit. Their grand total is somewhere upwards of about 500 units. However, more than 400 of those units, over 80%, were shipped before 1994. While they're not out of this business entirely, its best days are long behind them. And that is in part because their customers, it appears, began to demand the ability to produce these missiles for themselves. And to meet the demands of the market, the North Koreans were willing to ship the production technology and to begin supplying production lines in third countries. This is apparent from another source of data. Unfortunately, there isn't such a nice, neat source of data out there on this question of shipments of machine tools and parts and components. However, I've spent a fair amount of time searching news databases, and it turns out that if you search for seizures of shipments, not merely suspected shipments, but actual seizures of shipments, so it's known what was on board a ship or on a plane or inside a shipping container, it's possible to tally up what was seized, by whom, where, when, and observe the changes over time. And what we see is that in the missile field, most of the seizures that have occurred have been missile manufacturing equipment or parts. And almost all of these seizures, 7 out of 10 that I've found in news sources and also in some U.S. government or United Nations documents, almost all of these seizures took place between the years 1994 and 2000, which was the low point of North Korea's shipments of complete missiles. The complete missile trade rebounded very slightly after that. So what we see is a shift in the early to mid-90s from one form of trade to the other. It's also apparent that North Korea's customer base was already beginning to shrink a bit in this time, going from at least 7 to perhaps 5, as a couple of their customers dropped out. But the most dramatic shift takes place in the years 2001, 2010, or 11, the current period, where the seizures of North Korean shipments are almost exclusively conventional arms. And there's relatively little in the way of missile-related shipments that have actually been captured and examined and documented on that basis. What that reflects, I believe, is the near total collapse of their customer base, shrinking down to Iran and Syria. However, as I mentioned before, that relationship has become much more intimate. It is now a relationship of joint development. This is apparent from a few sources of information. One source of information is the U.S. intelligence community, which openly publishes an annual report to Congress on the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The most recent edition of this report, which you can find on the website of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, states that Iran is moving towards self-sufficiency in the production of ballistic missiles, but almost certainly remains dependent on foreign suppliers. By way of foreign suppliers, the intelligence community lists entities in China and Russia, along with North Korea. In the case of Syria, Syria is described as developing its own Scud variants with assistance from North Korea and Iran. So North Korea is in the picture for both countries. The United Nations panel of experts on North Korea, in a recent report, learned the following. The DPRK allegedly employs various techniques in collaborating with other countries in missile development, including exchange of visits by scientists and technicians, exchange of data, reciprocal participation in tests and analysis of results. I can also add to this that President Bashar al-Assad has very briefly commented on this relationship in a 2009 interview. He was asked about collaboration with North Korea and Iran in weapons of mass destructions, and he simply said, "We work trustingly together with many countries on research programs," which I think, in the context of what else we know, says a lot. So that's my funnel, if you like, the gradual diminishment of the missile export relationship, but perhaps also intensification. Now, how did this come about? I believe that the international community has really had four major policy efforts undertaken against missile proliferation since the 1980s. Enough time has passed now that we can make some summary judgments on their effectiveness. And when I offer these judgments, I would like to say these are not holistic judgments about these policies. Many policies are designed with multiple objects in mind. I'm only considering the effects on missile proliferation. So take it with a grain of salt. The first step, the first major thrust of policy has been export control diplomacy. I'm sure you're familiar with the missile technology control regime and related bilateral diplomatic efforts that have been undertaken between the United States and China and between other countries as well. This, I would say, has been, to a large extent, effective, not completely effective, but partly effective in reducing the supply of missiles. The Russians and the Chinese are much less active in the missile export field than they were in the 1980s. Certain other countries like Argentina never actually entered the field when they could have. On the other hand, there have been some shortcomings. Negotiations between Israel and North Korea in the early 1990s and the United States and North Korea in the late 1990s to curtail North Korean missile exports were inconclusive. And North Korea has had extensive access to dual-use components in Japan, China, and other countries. The Japanese have started cracking down in recent years. China may be another question. So this has been partly effective, not completely effective. Second is sanctions and interdiction. Sandy commented on this for a bit. I believe that when you consider the chronology of North Korean missile exports, the Proliferation Security Initiative, which began in 2003, has had no observable influence on the missile trade. Essentially, the trade in complete missiles was largely concluded a decade prior to this. And the trade in components and machine tools was already greatly diminished by this time. It was also largely concluded. North Korea's customer base had shrunk for reasons we'll get to in just a moment. And for this reason, PSI, while it's highly visible and has a lot of symbolic value and may have value in other aspects of curtailing WMD, hasn't had measurable influence on the missile trade. It is interesting to note that interdictions under PSI, Security Council Resolution 1718 and Security Council Resolution 1874, since 2009, have mostly resulted in the seizure of conventional weapons shipments. I think also we should point to something else, which is North Korea has adapted to the threat of interdiction. They've learned new techniques. Notwithstanding today's news about a shipment by sea to Burma, the UN's panel of experts believes that air transit has become increasingly important to the North Koreans. I think if we find better ways to crack down on air transit, they may find other ways yet. They're adaptable. The third major thrust of policy, which I believe has been partly effective, which coming from me is high praise, partly effective in reducing demand for missiles, is pressure on buyers. This has taken place in the background. It is not widely recognized. But most of North Korea's customer base has dropped out. We saw an example of this pressure publicly after a shipment of missiles from North Korea to Yemen was seized by the Spanish Navy briefly in late 2002. The United States openly pressured the Yemenis to discontinue their trade with the North Koreans. And I think there's good reason to guess that North Korea's other customers, previous customers, which were Egypt, Pakistan, Libya, the United Arab Emirates, also have curtailed their relationships with North Korea. And why have they done that? Well, in Libya's case, it's a matter of public record. In the case of the other countries, we don't know. However, I would observe that Egypt, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates are all recipients of advanced weapons technologies from Western states. And I find it difficult to imagine that they could maintain those arms supply relationships while still doing business with the North Koreans. So call it an educated guess, but I believe pressure on buyers, partly through their desire to have better weapons than the North Koreans could possibly supply them with, have helped to reduce the scope of the problem. And that is probably why PSI didn't make a difference, because the problem was being addressed by other means on the demand end, not on the supply end. Fourth and last, ballistic missile defenses are described as having multiple purposes. This is one of these cases where I'd like to remind the audience that this is not a holistic judgment. But ballistic missile defenses are supposed to reduce demand for ballistic missiles. They're supposed to render them futile. In this respect, I believe that BMD has been counterproductive. It has increased the problem. If you read the Ballistic Missile Defense Review report that the U.S. Department of Defense published last year, Iran, Syria, and North Korea are described as amassing increasingly large and sophisticated ballistic missile arsenals that are designed to overcome ballistic missile defenses, partially from qualitative technological means, simply improving their ability to overcome defenses through various countermeasures. Secondly, through numbers. If the size of a missile raid is increased from one missile to 5, 6, or 10 missiles, the salvo effect can overwhelm defenses. And the Iranians have frequently attempted to demonstrate salvos, probably just to make this point. So, in effect, what we have seen as a result of these measures is a diminishment of the missile proliferation problem, a considerable diminishment from what it could have been and from what it was, but also a hardening, a toughening of the aspect of the problem that remains in the form of the relationship between these three countries and possibly others. What could make these policies more effective as we try to attack this remaining hard core? I think a number of these same policy efforts could be made more effective if we had better participation from a wider range of countries, in particular China. Limited Chinese participation has, I believe, weakened these efforts. First of all, because of poor enforcement of dual-use export controls. Secondly, because there's little evidence of controls over transit of North Korean shipments through Chinese seaports or airspace. And third, because technology transfers from more advanced countries, which I believe includes China, could have implications for countermeasures against ballistic missile defenses. So at least three of the international community's major policy undertakings could potentially go further if there were better participation from China, and as well as Russia and other countries, but China may be the most important. I'd like to say, by way of conclusion, that this is a hope. It is not a prediction or a promise. The North Koreans have shown they're adaptable, and they might be able to adjust to a tougher stance from China and from other countries over time. But I think it is still worthwhile to make that effort to help mobilize the Chinese in this cause. Thank you.
All right, sir.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to join Sandy and Josh in thanking the organizers for bringing us all together for what I think is going to be a very interesting couple of days. It's also particularly nice to be on a panel with Josh because, as Sandy noted, we collaborate on a blog together, armscontrolwonk.com, and we spend a lot of time trading emails about precisely these subjects. And so it's a little interesting to have an audience as we continue this conversation.
But you can't read our emails, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's true. So it's an interesting question. Why focus on Myanmar, a single country, when there are so many interesting cases? And I suppose that there are two reasons. The first is I think it's just an interesting case because we don't have any firm or pat answers. It's an interesting case because we don't know, and so it is fun to mull over the questions, look at the data, reassemble it, and have an argument that, at least I think right now, doesn't have an obvious conclusion. But there's a second reason, which is the conversation that we have about Myanmar, or the conversation that we're going to have, I think reveals some very interesting things about how patterns of nuclear commerce or patterns of proliferation have changed over the past few decades. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the canonical route to building a bomb, the way that our safeguards are designed, and at least until recently, the way that export controls were designed, we largely, as an international community, focused on the plutonium route to building a nuclear weapon. The expectation was that a state would acquire a nuclear weapon in the way that North Korea did, which is you would build a large and very visible nuclear reactor. You might try to hide it, but you would likely fail. And then you would build a large and very visible reprocessing facility. And that also would be very likely to be detected. And that's essentially what North Korea did, and it's also what North Korea tried to do in Syria. And I think our experience as a community has been that we've always found out when a state is building a reactor or a reprocessing facility before it went into operation. There have been some close calls. Sometimes we chose not to act on that information. But generally speaking, I think maybe even we got a little bit comfortable about our ability to detect proliferation. And that started to change. It started to change in the late 1970s, although I think maybe we remained as a community a little bit smug longer than that. And the thing that changed that was the rise of the technology of gas centrifuges, right, which is the second route to building a nuclear weapon, which is enriching uranium. And, I think we all love the information revolution. We have these beautiful high-definition video screens, and I've got my iPhone out, and Sandy's playing on his laptop there. But one of the really neat things about the information revolution was the ability to do computer-controlled machining. And that led to unbelievable precision in aerospace technologies, and that made the ability to build centrifuges, basically tubes of very high-strength material that spin at speeds of hundreds of meters per second, commercially viable in Europe and somewhat available. And so what is so interesting is early on, I think, the international community thought that developing states like Pakistan wouldn't be able to build centrifuges because it required a significant industrial base. But what we didn't understand or appreciate was that these were essentially dual-use technologies that were widely available. Not the centrifuges themselves, but the machine tools that one uses to make them, and many of the components that go into the centrifuges. They may have very unique specifications, but the network of suppliers that you would use for a centrifuge program are basically dual-use suppliers who supply all kinds of industries for everything from aerospace to, and I'm not kidding, kitchenware. And what happened is that led to this kind of fundamental change. Thank you. There were proliferation networks based on gas centrifuge technology, starting with the Pakistani program in the 1970s and going through the 1980s with the Brazilian and the Iraqi networks. But what really got our attention was the Khan network in 2002. And the Khan network supplied customers in Libya, Iran, and North Korea. And what was interesting about that network, of course, was, yes, there was the provision of a few centrifuge machines, but really the support was on the provision of machine tools and the provision of components. And what the Khan network did that was so interesting was not to make those things itself, but to essentially Khan acted as a middleman for a network of suppliers. Right? His innovation was finding all of these suppliers and putting them together, and then putting this together in a nice package. And that's a fundamental change in proliferation. It's a fundamental change because the technologies are widely available, they're difficult to control, because they have dual uses, there's very seldom a clear nuclear signature, and because a centrifuge facility itself from the outside doesn't really look like anything special. It's very hard to detect. I often like to sort of glumly joke that it's not an accident that the mythical Iraqi nuclear weapons program was a centrifuge program. Right? It is precisely the kind of thing that you're not likely to have much evidence about and so you base mostly on inferences. Which brings us to Myanmar. Because we don't know a lot about Myanmar, and we are making a lot of inferences. But it's still a very, very interesting question. I will start at the outset by saying I don't know whether Myanmar is building nuclear weapons. I will just note some very interesting things and then talk about what I think are the implications of those things for nonproliferation policy. The first fact to note is that we know that Myanmar, at least until very recently, openly sought a research reactor, a small nuclear reactor, from Russia. And that deal didn't seem to go anywhere, in part, it seems, because of cost. The government of Myanmar's explanation for this is that they wanted to build a nuclear science center centered on this research reactor making medical isotopes. But we can obviously all imagine sort of shades of Syria, where we'd be equally concerned that they might simply choose to build a reprocessing facility and recover the plutonium from the spent fuel. And the other thing that Myanmar did with Russia is that Myanmar has been sending very large numbers of students to study in Russia for advanced degrees, and some of those students are studying in fields that are related to nuclear technology, including fields that seem out of place with Myanmar's current level of expertise. So students studying reprocessing of plutonium, processing of uranium, a variety of technologies that there is at least very little prospect in the near term for employment in Myanmar in. The second thing I think that causes us to pay attention to Myanmar is there are these very close links to North Korea. There's already been some discussion of the possibility of missile shipments. The bit of data that I find most compelling is a trip report that some Burmese dissidents have placed out into the open source literature, which was prepared by a delegation of military officers from Myanmar who visited North Korea. And they visited a number of places, including the final assembly factory for North Korea's Scud missiles, which is reasonably attention-getting. But even more attention-getting than that, for me at least, I think for Josh, it's a very, very interesting set of photographs that show the head of the military delegation having dinner with a gentleman named John Byung-ho, who I suppose if you follow North Korea, you know is the person who, at least until his retirement recently, has been principally responsible for North Korea's proliferation-related activities. Right? He was the person who interacted with A.Q. Khan, and he is the person who we believe, probably through the agency of his son-in-law, is responsible for the reactor in Syria. And so we don't know what they discussed at dinner. Maybe they just discussed, the work style of cadres in Stalinist states. But it seems a pretty good bet that they may have discussed other things. Whether it was only missiles or whether it was missiles and nuclear, I don't know. But that is a very interesting and potentially disturbing piece of evidence. Now, we don't have a lot of data about a nuclear program per se, and I will walk you through what we do have. Obviously, there are the pictures of John, right, which is the kind of thing that probably exists in archives that we haven't yet seen for Pakistan and for Syria. But there are a few other things. Myanmar has openly admitted to mining uranium, and they've declared the existence of 5 uranium deposits. And they've done so in a general way. They've listed sort of general areas, but they haven't been terribly transparent about the nature of those mines, whether they are actively recovering uranium or not. And then there are these 2 curious workshops that Myanmar has built. Now, Myanmar has built a few machine shops, workshops with high-grade machine tools. And usually, or at least in one other case I can think of, when they inaugurate one of these workshops with machine tools, there's an entry in the New Light of Myanmar, which is their paper, and there are some pictures of a dignitary touring it, and there's some basic information. But there are these 2 workshops that didn't get that kind of treatment. and they were outfitted with machine tools from German and Swiss companies. And the machine shops themselves were said to be for training and training non-military personnel. But we know the German company, the German company that supplied some of the tools, had some questions about that and actually sent a few delegations to check up on the tools and found some very interesting things. I mean, among other things, they were very skeptical. They noticed that there were only young men of sort of military age working at the facilities. And later there have been pictures that have emerged that showed that those men often wear uniforms. And so we're pretty sure that they're military workshops of some type. And then there is this curious document that links one piece of equipment from one of these workshops to this other very interesting facility, which the Myanmar dissidents, the Burmese dissidents, call the No. 1 Science and Technology Regiment, which is a very strange military encampment being sort of built in the north of the country in the middle of nowhere. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that piece of equipment is worth discussing in a little bit of detail. Well, I'll spare you the details of the equipment, but the primary allegation of a nuclear program, right, concerns the equipment that is built or has been seen in photographs at these workshops. And the allegation by a colleague of ours, Bob Kelly, that this equipment is used in a uranium enrichment program. And it is the case that one of those pieces of equipment was requested by this No. 1 Science and Technology Regiment, which would sort of link the two sites. And nearby the No. 1 Science and Technology Regiment, there is a large ore processing facility. We don't know what it's for. Could be for gold. There's a lot of gold mining in the region. But there are also uranium deposits in the region, so it could be for uranium. We just don't know. And then there's this fellow, Coco O, who's the head of their Department of Atomic Energy. And we have pictures of him at these two workshops showing the German delegation around, and he's the person who signed the end-user certificate, which we think is false now, since we're pretty sure they're military facilities. And there are also pictures of him touring the construction at the No. 1 Science and Technology Regiment. So what's going on? I mean, it's reasonably suspicious, but there's no smoking gun there. Now, as I said, Bob Kelly thinks that the equipment that he saw in the pictures is for uranium enrichment. But there's a very vigorous debate about this in the community. And there are very many people who point to perfectly reasonable alternative explanations. And the most leading, I'd say the leading alternative explanation, which I confess I find compelling, is that the items are used for the extraction of rare earths, right, which are these metals that you use in cell phones and things, which aren't particularly rare, but they're rare in concentrations that are worth extracting. They're very expensive, and China sort of cornered the market on them, and a lot of countries are interested in developing these things. And I will admit, I found a textbook, interestingly enough, by two scientists that does tend to lend support to the idea that all of this equipment is for the extraction of rare earths. Every single piece of equipment that Bob identified appears in this textbook being used in rare earth extraction. And so you would think, oh, well, this is exculpatory, right? Not so fast. Let me tell you who wrote the textbook. Two scientists at the Bhabha Atomic Research Center in India. BARC, right? That's India's nuclear weapons program. And moreover, and Corey Hinderstein, who found this facility, is here. The cover for India's gas centrifuge program is a rare metals extraction plant. They call their gas centrifuge plant the rare metals plant. So, what to do? It's also worth noting many rare earths are found in uranium tailings. So we are at this interesting case, I think, where we have all of this data that is, I find, incredibly suspicious. But there is no smoking gun. There is no obvious thing we can point to and say, aha, right? that is a nuclear weapons program. And I think it's very interesting. How do we react to the idea of a rare metals project, right? Is that something that explains away a nuclear program, or is that something that we correlate to a nuclear weapons program? I think it's very difficult. From a policy perspective, I find this an interesting question. We have this kind of debate about whether Myanmar is or is not building a nuclear weapon. But that's kind of only a meaningful debate in an abstract sense. What we really want to know is what should we do about it, right? And if we're uncertain, our policy ought to reflect uncertainty. And so I would suggest a couple of things and then raise a bigger macro-level question. The first thing is we have to get Myanmar to be more transparent. I note that a senior Myanmar official told John McCain that they were abandoning their nuclear research program because it was too expensive. And that's sort of all well and good, but that doesn't make me feel any better. I mean, what I really want is transparency. What I really want is Myanmar to fill out the questionnaire that the OECD and the IAEA ask for their annual report on uranium production and resources, which Myanmar has never done. Sign and ratify the additional protocol that would give the IAEA more authority to go in and look at places like this, right? Like there ought to be some kind of access, maybe to this ore processing facility that we don't know its purpose. And the other option is for the members of ASEAN, who are all signatories to the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty, to use a provision in that treaty to request a fact-finding mission, right? To be able to send technical experts to Myanmar to look at a few of these places, which is their right under this treaty when there are questions about whether the parties are in compliance or not. But I think there's also a sort of more macro-level question about what this means for how Myanmar fits into the world of proliferation networks. And so I will just close with two options. I mean, one option is that Myanmar is a client like Syria, right? So the fact that they can't afford the Russian reactor means that we ought to expect them to try to go get the North Koreans to build a reactor for them, or get the North Koreans to give them something else, right? But there's another alternative possibility, which I think is equally interesting, which is Myanmar is serving as some kind of front or transshipment point for North Korea. And there are two bits of evidence that suggest that. The first is this curious case of these magnetometers that a North Korean company based in Hong Kong purchased in Japan. And you can use magnetometers either for missiles or you can use them in an enrichment program. It's underdetermined. But that North Korean company in Hong Kong, which very well knew it could not export those magnetometers to North Korea, had them sent to Myanmar because Myanmar isn't under sanctions for those kinds of things. And so that would suggest that, as Josh has noted, in the missile field, the North Koreans have adapted. It's certainly a possibility that it has occurred to them that they could use Myanmar as a transshipment point. I think I will stop there. I think that is an interesting enough place to end.
Good. Just one area that we haven't had a chance to explore, maybe it will come up in the questions and answers, is the political relationships among some of these countries and why there might be an inclination to help each other apart from just the mere dollars and cents or the barter relationships. But why don't we open the floor to some questions and start the discussion that way? Yes, sir? And please do identify yourself.
My name is Alexei Finenko. I'm from Russia, from Institute of International Security Studies of Russian Academy of Sciences. I have two questions about North Korean nuclear issues. My first question: what is the strategy of Obama administration in a North Korean crisis? I understand what was the Bush Republican administration strategy: impose disarmament of North Korea. Probably military balance, a lot of military pressure to North Korea. But does Obama administration have a real strategy in North Korean crisis? And my second question is about the North Korean missile technologies, because as far as I remember, the missile technologies of North Korea, there are old Soviet Scud technologies. But why the other states would like to buy these old missile technologies?
Well, I think we heard a bit in the last session about the sort of tentativeness right now of the administration's attitudes toward North Korea. We are pressing for the six-party talks to start again, but not to the extent that we're prepared to offer incentives. The isolation of North Korea continues. The efforts to interdict exports continues. But I would say we're sort of in this holding pattern for a while. I think the real focus of the administration is Iran, and the expectation that the situation in North Korea is sort of not going to change very much one way or the other right now, and we should try to get this other problem taken care of first. But other colleagues have a comment on this, and then we'll take one more question.
Well, I could comment on the missile question.
Please.
Sure. Why do countries want outmoded Soviet missile technology from the North Koreans? I think one answer is because the Russians and the Chinese have mostly stepped away from the marketplace, and that's what you could get. That's what was available. Not very good, but it's what there was. I would also add that most of these countries are in the Middle East, and they had the experience of being participants or close onlookers to the Iran-Iraq war when missiles of this type were fired into major cities, and they wanted to make sure they had a lot of them, or missiles of their own at least, to deter that kind of treatment from their neighbors in the future, or to inflict it on their neighbors in the future.
See you in the back, and then we'll maybe get to you if we have a moment.
Hello, I'm Jim Nolt from the World Policy Institute in New York. I have a question about the Myanmar case, which I think one of the points you didn't raise is if Myanmar is pursuing a nuclear weapons program, who do they think is their enemy? Who would they be deterring? But I think maybe your last comment suggests the most interesting answer, which is they may be participating in one of their national industries, which is smuggling, and maybe helping North Korea extend its own network.
Well, my sense is that these very, very isolated countries are seeking whatever tools they can find to try to reinforce their ability to, survive against the onslaught of international opprobrium and pressure. And I think we've seen, at least in the North Korean case, that a nuclear weapons program eventually sort of serves that purpose. But that seems to be an awfully long way down the road for Myanmar. And I have to say, I too have some skepticism. But perhaps you'd like to comment.
Just very quickly, one of the reasons I like to try to commune with the facts is because my guess is it would sort of inform the answer to that question. I mean, the Burmese dissidents paint this as a kind of anti-Thai thing, but I have my doubts about that. My inclination is it's some combination of precisely the two options you outlined. There's a kind of siege mentality, right? There's a view of nuclear weapons as a guarantor of a country's sovereignty against international pressure. But then there also are the very obvious advantages engaging in smuggling. And it may not be even the country that chooses. It may be individuals in the country who find it very lucrative.
There's a question over here. Yes, go ahead. And then I'll come back over here.
My name is Dmitry Konokhov. I'm a representative of Center for Energy and Security Studies, Moscow, Russian Federation. I have not a question, but some comments to Mr. Liu's statement about Myanmar. So I myself, with my colleague Anton Khlopkov, recently completed a big investigation about Russian view on Myanmar nuclear program. It was a result of conversation with representatives of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russian geologist who was making some explorations in Myanmar, and Russian universities who were teaching Myanmar specialists. First of all, let me correct you that hardly the reason for a failure to complete a research center in Myanmar was the cost. Most likely it was failure of Myanmar to assign additional agreement to the IAEA safeguards. And because the cost wasn't even officially named, the negotiations between Myanmar and potential contractor of this research facility, Atoms to Export, was broken before the actual price was named. So I have a lot of details to name, and it would take a lot of time. Our research investigation is available on the disseminate tables right on the exit, and I also want to speak later with Mr. Lewis and give him my comments.
It will be a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good. I will have one last comment then. Oh, sir. Do you have a microphone?
Well, my name is Masood Khan. I'm from Pakistan. Comments, 3. Basically, you, Mr. Spector, you frequently refer to Pakistan. One clarification. Yes, it was determined through an investigative process that A.Q. Khan's operation was a rogue operation. And the details of that investigation were shared with the United States, China, Japan, and Korea, the countries which were most concerned about that development. In fact, after the unraveling of the A.Q. Khan network, we put in place a national command authority, and therefore we have put stringent security measures in place. Second thing that I want to point out, you mentioned in passing that maybe Pakistan has passed some missile technology to Iran. That's not correct.
I said it was an area that Iran might be interested in.
Yes. I just want to clarify, because it was light mentioning, so I just wanted to clarify. Third point, Pakistan is a non-NPT nuclear weapon state. We have every right to develop nuclear program. Like NPT states, we are not signatory to NPT. And I was surprised that you didn't mention other non-NPT states. And we hope that the United States would not create new norms of exceptionalism, because by doing so, the proponents of non-proliferation would create a new norm for underwriting proliferation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for putting those comments on the record. I just would clarify my comment earlier, and I wanted to do it a second time. I was speculating as to what Iran might have an interest in that other states have, and I believe I specifically said I had no reason to believe that a transfer from Pakistan had taken place, so I want to repeat that. And then with respect to the other non-NPT states, Israel, India, North Korea, I think this is really a history issue. In other words, the A.Q. Khan episode has a sort of lingering effect, and we think back about it. And that's the reason, I'd say, for giving some attention to the Pakistani situation. So thank you for the clarifications. Corey, we're supposed to leave. All right, well, thank you. I thank my colleagues on the panel, and thank you all for participating with us. Good. All right.
Now we will now have a quick coffee break. Due to time constraint, we will have about 10-minute coffee break. And next session on Japan's nuclear program after Fukushima will be the next one in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much.